Welcome to Words on the Outside with Laura Bynum. Our latest offering is contributed by author Marc Leepson, who's written for everything from the Congressional Quarterly to the VVA Veteran to the Washington Post, and who's been interviewed by such programs as The Today Show, The History Channel, NPR's Here and Now, and The Diane Rehm Show. Marc reads the introduction of his biographical U.S. history novel, What So Proudly We Hailed, Francis Scott Key, A Life.
The man could talk. The well-connected, highly successful Washington, D.C. lawyer, the scion of an aristocratic Maryland family, was known throughout the early American Republic for his multifaceted oratorical skills in the courtroom, in front of patriotic, religious, and political gatherings, and in the salon-like atmosphere of his finally appointed Georgetown home. From the minute he arose to speak at a trial in 1911, one courtroom observer wrote, "The crowd was brought back from the doors and every adjoining part of the house, drawn by his peculiar celebrity as an orator." The celebrated orator loved poetry. From the time he was a child, he spun out rhyming verses with prolific regularity, verses that, with one giant exception, were at best overly flowery and at worst embarrassingly amateurish. Verses that their author never meant to be seen or read outside the circle of his family and friends. The giant exception was the patriotic poem he wrote on the fateful night of September 13th, 14th, 1814, during one of the War of 1812's most ferocious and crucial engagements, the Battle of Baltimore. That night, a massive British fleet of warships tried to pound the city into submission with a constant stream of bomb, mortar, and rocket shells as an intense thunderstorm punctuated the darkness. The poem that 35-year-old Francis Scott Key wrote that night, initially titled The Defense of Fort McHenry, contained lines that have melded into the fabric of American life. Put to music, the words morphed into the Star-Spangled Banner, which became the official national anthem in 1931. Two mysteries surround the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner. First, did Frank Key, as he was known to family and friends, write a poem or a song that night? Described by family members as unmusical, Key had never written a song in his life aside from several religious hymns, which makes it unlikely that he was thinking musically in Baltimore Harbor when he scribbled the words, "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light," on the back of a letter that he fished out of his pocket. On the other hand, this poem, as well as one he had written 7 years earlier, was set in rhyme and meter precisely to the tune of To Anacreon in Heaven, a well-known song of the era. Star-Spangled Banner mystery number 2, no one knows for certain how the poem wound up at a Baltimore printer the following morning, nor do we know how the words later found their way onto sheet music of the tune that was the theme song of the Anacreontic Society in England, a gentleman's club that met to listen to musical performances, to dine lavishly, and to belt out songs. Compounding the mysteries is the fact that Francis Scott Key had precious little to say about the poem or song after he wrote it. Key did not speak of it in the one letter he wrote after the battle in which he recounted his Baltimore mission to free an American prisoner taken after the Battle of Bladensburg, and it appears that he spoke of the song in public only once in a political speech in 1834, nearly 20 years later, in which Key deferentially said that the credit for the peace went to the defenders of Baltimore, not the lawyer-poet who set down the words. The fourth verse of the Star-Spangled Banner contains the lines, "Then conquer we must when our cause is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust." Francis Scott Key, as those lines suggest, was both extremely patriotic and pious from the earliest days of his childhood in the early 1780s until his death on January 11th, 1843. As a young man, he seriously considered joining the Episcopal priesthood, but instead opted for the law and a secular life. Virtually everyone who came in contact with Key remarked on his piety. He peppered his letters to family and friends with references to the Bible and its teachings. The pious Key devoted himself to religious causes throughout his life. In him, the Episcopal Church had one of its few great laymen, one student of Key's church life wrote. Indeed, for decades, Key was an influential and effective lay supporter of the Episcopal Church, taking an active role in 3 churches in Washington. He served as lay rector for many years, leading services and visiting the sick. Among the scores of poems he wrote, many dealt with religious themes. Although he disdained politics for much of his life, in his 50s, Key became an ardent supporter of Andrew Jackson and his newly formed Democratic Party. He became a trusted advisor to Jackson after the Tennessean won the presidency in 1828. A member of Jackson's kitchen cabinet, Key was steadfastly loyal to Old Hickory throughout his tumultuous presidency. As a reward, Jackson appointed Key U.S. Attorney for Washington, a post in which he served for 8 years from 1833 to 1841. A slave owner from a large slave-owning family, Key was an early and ardent opponent of slave trafficking. He became one of the founders and strongest and most active proponents of the American Colonization Society, which sent free blacks to Africa beginning in the early 1820s. Yet, Key's legacy with respect to the peculiar institution is cloudy. Neither he nor the Colonization Society called for the abolition of slavery. Their mission instead focused solely on sending free blacks to Africa. That was one reason that few abolitionists had any use for the society. By all accounts, Key treated his own slaves humanely and freed several during his lifetime. What's more, he had a deserved reputation for providing free legal advice to impoverished blacks in Washington. Still, the fact remains that Francis Scott Key bought and sold other human beings throughout his adult life, and that his answer to the slavery question, the American Colonization Society, did nothing whatsoever to end slavery and precious little to make life better for free African Americans. It is no great secret that the best subject is the ill-behaved subject, the biographer Stacy Schiff recently wrote. The ideal one would combine Houdini's close calls, Boss Tweed's ethics, Richard Nixon's friends, and John Cheever's sexuality. If Francis Scott Key was anything, he was well-behaved virtually his entire life. Outside of being part of the ragtag militia that folded like a cheap suit, thereby allowing the British to march into Washington in August 1914 at Bladensburg, and his long night of the soul watching the Battle of Baltimore unfold, Key never experienced any close calls. With few exceptions, he was as ethically and morally straight as a monk. But Francis Scott Key is a great subject. He led a fascinating and full life in a portentous era of American history. One of the most famous, admired, and accomplished men in the early republic, Key was a patriotic, hard-working, able, and well-connected attorney in the nation's capital who played important roles in many high-profile court cases, including scores of cases before the Supreme Court. He was a morally upright, conservative, and deeply religious family man, and he was a national player throughout his adult life in the most significant social, political, economic, and humanitarian issue of the early nation, slavery. In short, Francis Scott Key lived a full life, deeply engaged in the most important issues of his time. His burst of poetic, patriotic fervor on that September night in 1814 enshrined his name in the ranks of the nation's iconic figures. What follows is a look at the life and times of Francis Scott Key, a name virtually every American knows, yet the details of his life are largely unknown to Americans today.